Stanford University.
Welcome to the seminar on People, Computers, and Design. I'm Terry Winograd. Today and next week, we have some of our own, sort of, in that next week's speaker is Bjorn Hartman, who graduated from our group a couple of years ago, has been teaching at UC Berkeley, and he'll be talking about work on crowdsourcing. This has been a topic of several of our talks this quarter. So next week, Bjorn Hartman. This week, we have Sudhindra Hangal, who is current PhD student finishing up working in Monica Lamb's Moby Social group as well as the HCI group and looking at processing the information that we all have stored away in what we do with email, what we do with our computers every day, and how to make use of that to help us in that interaction. So today, Sudhindra.
Thanks. And Monica, do you want to say something too?
Oh yeah. I'd like to give a little bit of background.
This is Monica Lamb.
Hi, I'm Monica Lamb. So I just want to introduce Sudhindra. Sudhindra is not your typical PhD student. I knew Sudhindra maybe 12 years ago or so. You know, it's not that he was a PhD student all these years, by the way. Although I have students that lasted that long. Anyway, I knew Sudhindra when he was a Sun employee, full-time Sun employee, and part-time master student. And even as a part-time master student, he was already doing research. And we had a paper in software engineering about 10 years ago. And after that, he continued to publish on his own as a full-time employee at Sun, and that was very unusual. And I think that his publication record is something that a lot of PhD graduates would be envious of. And and then he returned to India, started his own company, and about 5 years ago, he wrote me and he said, I wanted to become a PhD student. And I still remember what he said in the letter. He said, I would rather be a poor graduate student and have a chance to do whatever I want. And so he did, and he came to Stanford, came back as a PhD student, and he took full opportunity of that in the sense that he completely changed his area into HCI, totally different from all the systems work that he has done in the past. And I think he did an incredibly good job, and he's going to tell us some fascinating stories about what is in our emails that we have collected all these years.
I have my own.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica, for the nice introduction. I have to say it's a huge honor to be speaking in CS 547 because attending these seminars is what got me interested in HCI in the first place. I used to work on microprocessors and computer architecture and so on. But hearing some of these fascinating talks over the years back when I was doing my master's is really what convinced me that I should turn towards HCI. All right. Okay. All right, so I'm going to be speaking about putting personal digital archives to work. And I'd like to acknowledge upfront my collaborators on the project, Abhinay, Diana, Peter, Cindy, TJ, and of course Monica and Jeff. I'd like to begin by introducing the idea of a personal digital archive. And the idea actually goes back a long way to something that I'm sure is familiar to many people in the room, which is Vannevar Bush's famous essay, As We May Think, from 1945, where he defines this idea of a memex. And a memex, the definition of a memex is a device in which an individual, so note that means it's personal, stores all his books, records, and communication. Sounds like an archive. And which is mechanized so it can be consulted with speed and flexibility. So it sounds like it's computable. And this must have seemed an outrageous vision at the time, but it's becoming close to reality. And of course, Vannevar Bush was really just extrapolating from the fact that people have had books, records, and communications archived for a long time, except that they were just in paper form. You couldn't actually compute with them. And here are some examples of classic archives. Does anyone know what this is? It's a page from the notebook of a very famous person. Yes. So if you see the top, it says the laws of motion. That should give you a pretty good clue.
Cambridge University gave it away too.
Yes, that's right. So all these are online. They're wonderful documents of the record. You can see here that there were actually 10 laws of motion in his notebook, and I think he boiled them down to 3 for his book later. This is his notebook as an undergraduate at Cambridge in 1661. This is a page from the notebook of Charles Darwin, where he's talking about, this is the question, and the question is whether to get married or not get married. And he has written down all the reasons to get married on the left and all the reasons not to get married on the right. And you can see he was very systematic in his personal life as well. And the answer, of course, is marry, 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 QED. Here's another famous letter from Albert Einstein to Gandhi in 1931, expressing admiration for his nonviolent methods and hoping to meet him someday. Here's a memo from July 1969 by William Safire, which was supposed to be read by the president in case the moon landing had failed. So this is just a few days before the moon landing was attempted. And it says things like Armstrong and Aldrin know there's no hope for the recovery, but they know that there is hope for mankind in the sacrifice, and they'll be mourned by the family and friends and so on. So this gives a clue to the thinking at the moment without reflection on what really happened. And finally, here's one example of, this is a memo from a guy called John D.F. Black to Gene Roddenberry in 1966. Which is talking about the opening narration of Star Trek and says, I think the narration needs more drama. And it should be like in Kirk's voice, space, the final frontier, and where no man has gone before. So these are all wonderful examples of archives which capture the historical record. And I'm personally motivated. I want to mention a personal connection to archives, which is, these are the diaries of my own great-grandfather-in-law who lived in southwestern India in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And he left behind 50 of these diaries, and I found them a few years ago, and I started going through them, and I realized how much information was both actually recorded as well as implicitly reflected in these diaries. And I was just thinking what this meant for our generation, because we don't have so many paper records anymore. We're doing more and more stuff digitally. And what this means for our great-grandchildren or something like that, looking back on our lives 100 years from now. So back to Vannevar Bush's vision of this archive that you can access mechanically, and that's becoming true to an extent today. And you have all these ideas of total recall. That's Gordon Bell over there, who did this My Life Bits project, where he's trying to digitize pretty much everything he's ever seen or read. The quantified self movement is talking about all kinds of sensors to capture everything that's happening around you all the time. We had Dave Karger here last week talking about how to make it easier to capture even more information, make sure that nothing gets dropped, capture things in the flow and things like that. So all this is happening. This is happening for ordinary people. We don't all have to be Isaac Newton to have our archives. It's possible for people to collect and preserve their archives for the sake of perhaps only the 10 people who care about them. And what does that mean, and how are we going to make use of these archives? I mean, that's the central question in my work. So when I started looking at what kind of archives we're actually collecting, it was pretty clear that email archives are probably the single most important or most valuable thing to study, because first of all, email reaches a lot of people, and a lot of people are collecting records in the form of email, because a lot of email is automatically archived. Sent mail, for example, is always archived because it's used as a tool of record. It's also been around for a very long time. So there are people who have 30 or 40 or at least 30 years of email, particularly in universities and places like that. And studying what their archives mean to them, or how they can use their archives, will probably shed light on how other people can use digital archives going forward. It's an open federated architecture. That means it's not bound to any one company's fortunes going up or down. It's easy to capture and preserve, and it's really lightweight. So for example, I of course, do a lot of email like all of you, and I looked at my own archive for the last, say, 7 years since I got Gmail, and this sort of never delete anything mindset. And if I strip out the attachments, I find that the size of the archive is only 100 megabytes, which is nothing. 100 megabytes is a lot of text, but in terms of storage, it's like, it costs 1 cent or something like that. A lifetime is probably, if you compress it, a lifetime can probably be stored at the price of, at 1 cent. So it has all these great properties, but also has a lot of challenges, which are representative of digital archives in general. It's easy to collect lots of stuff, it's easy to collect lots of crap as well. This often got little structure, it's got some structure, but over a long time that structure changes and then things get messy very quickly. It's got a very large volume, there is lots of, there are a few gems hidden amongst lots of very routine or mundane kind of data. But at the same time, you don't know what's mundane today may become very valuable at some point. I mean, all the examples we saw earlier of, say, whatever Darwin was writing, he probably didn't know it was going to become important or historians were going to be studying it. There's a great amount of diversity, particularly in email. I mean, people use it for all kinds of things. It started with essentially personal letters replacing person-to-person communication, and then we're doing all kinds of things like buying stuff on the internet or doing work projects, hanging out on mailing lists, sending evites, sending around, sharing links, and so on. So there's a very wide variety of material in the archive. And it's hard to explore because it's hard to know, if you know what you're looking for, it's probably easy to search, but it's hard to know just get a sense of what's in the archive, get an overview of what's in there. And that's some of the challenges that I hope to shed some light on. So with that motivation, this is an outline for the rest of the talk. So I'll talk about browsing archives and 4 specific challenges: how you organize, summarize, engage, and explore with the archives, and what users do people find once you give them tools that get them past these challenges. And in the second part, I'll talk about more of what we are calling experience-infused applications. And these are applications where people are not actually looking at the archive or browsing them, but the archives are implicitly helping them perform some task better. And I'll talk specifically about the tasks of browsing and search. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts about the future. So let's consider browsing archives. So this is a typical email client today, which is really optimized for tackling day-to-day email. It's not really meant for browsing thousands of messages that you may have forgotten about or accumulated over a long period of time. So this is probably not the right interface when you want to get a sense of a large-scale archive. And that's why we built something called MUSE, Memories Using Email, which is, think of it as sort of a read-only, it's not really a client, but think of it as a way to browse and peruse a large number of messages in a fairly convenient way. So I'll talk about how some of the technical challenges that we encountered and the solutions we came up with for those. But even before you attempt to solve any of the interesting problems embedded there are lots of problems in just getting to the data. And this is just a very practical matter. It's where is the data? I mean, I've talked to lots of people. I've asked them, where's your data? And they say, oh, it's on my laptop, it's on my desktop, it's in the cloud somewhere, it's in files saved somewhere, I'm not sure where it is, it's on a CD which is in the shoebox in the basement, and so on. So it's just hard for people to get access to it. And we do what little we can to try and help them aggregate information from different sources. There are lots of privacy concerns because particularly email archives are meant for private communication and capture everything from love letters to health records to financial documents and so on. People are not quite sure what they will find when they go in there, and they're a little wary to even look at it. One of the things we do is, and of course they're very wary about giving you access to anything. And we tried this by setting up a website initially where people would upload email, and that wouldn't fly. So we have to make it a tool that people will download onto their own machine, run it in the privacy and security of their own machine, and explore on their own. And this also has implications for the tools and techniques we use. We can't afford to use very heavyweight or super heavy data mining techniques. It has to be something that will run on end users' machines. Users are unsure what is where. I mean, frequently we hear this all the time. Users tell us, oh, I have all that kind of data in that folder, in that account. And then when you actually run MUSE on that account, it's actually got something else. And this is true for even people. We have had professional archivists use our tools, and this is even for people who are very aware of consistent filing and foldering and all that. This is a common problem, particularly over the long term, because it's hard to be consistent over the long term. So one thing we do is we say that sent mail is a good default, because sent mail is what engages you in a sense. You may be receiving lots of email, particularly on mailing lists and so on, which you're not paying much attention to. So if you had to analyze only one thing, or if you're not sure where the interesting data is, you would just go after the sent mail, and that's a reasonable first approximation for something that's of value and reflects what the user is thinking about. And then there are the usual data cleaning issues in any kind of data mining project. There's duplicate data, messages are duplicated. Over time, the headers are bad, or the format changes or something. Then we try and guess things like dates or email addresses which are not quite correct. We have to resolve entities because people's email addresses frequently change. The way they spell their names changes. It's first name, or last name, comma, first name, or middle initial comes in, or it's just first name dot last name at company.com or something like that. So we have to try and guess as much as we can from the patterns that we've seen, and try and resolve these identities and make sure that there's only one identity for every person. So once you've done all this kind of cleaning work, then you can get to the interesting technical challenges. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the challenge of organization. So like I already said, folders are not entirely reliable. If you have them, sure, you can use, if you have a regular folder structure, you can use it, but quite often you don't have it. So we came up with this idea of actually using the communication structure to infer groups of people and organize by groups of people. And that's a very natural way to organize it, except that the groups in this context, particularly over long term again, are a little bit messy. So we have coined this term social topology to capture this idea of person social groups that may be overlapping, that may be nested, that may have to be merged from individual component groups, and in the extreme case there may be one or two people who are extremely important and should be considered a group for the purpose of organization. So to make that concrete, here's an example of a social topology, which is an extended family, and there's one group which is the whole extended family. Within that there is a smaller group of mom, dad, sister, brother. Within that there are subgroups, and then mom, dad, and grandma, that's yet another group. Maybe there's another like singleton somewhere else. So we have to come up with algorithms that can deal with all of these cases, and it turned out that none of the algorithms that we came across would do all of these cases, so we had to design our own. And this is particularly for egocentric networks, where you only have the view of one person's, you only have one person's view of the network. You don't have a central sort of system administrator view of who's talking to whom. And there's a couple of papers on the algorithm, and it's kind of detailed, so I won't go through all of it. I'll just give you a flavor of how you can do this. So you start with an input of, so each line is a message, and let's say those are the recipients of the message, A, B, and D, A, C, and D, A, C, and so on. This is not considering the owner of the archive. The owner is kept separate. And now the question is, you have this kind of mess of data, and what you would like to do ideally is find n groups that somehow represent the input reasonably well, somehow approximate the input with as small an error as possible. And the rough intuition of the algorithm is that you define operations between these groups, so you can merge two groups, for example. So ABD, ACD, you can say, oh, they merge to become ABCD, and that introduces a little bit of loss of information, but maybe that's okay. Or maybe it's better to say that, oh, AD is a group because it's part of both the groups, and maybe you keep that and you throw away ABD and ACD, or maybe you just throw away one of them and keep the other one. So you define these operations, and then what you do is you try and whittle down the number of groups. So you may start with maybe 50,000 groups, and you want to get that down to maybe 20 groups, or something that's manageable for a human to look at and understand. And while there are n groups, you keep either dropping groups or intersecting, merging. You keep reducing the number of groups till you based on some cost function, so as to lose as little information as possible.
So can you say one more sentence about why you would want to do this?
I will come to that immediately after this. So this is fundamentally an organizational principle for this, for thousands of messages, and we're going to use this to organize the messages.
The lists here are the list of 2 addresses on a message.
2 CC, BCC. So we're just assuming that there's some evidence of grouping. If A, B, and D are in the same message, there is some sort of cohesion between them. There's a reason why they're in the same message. And right now we don't distinguish between 2 and CC and BCC and so on. By the way, there's a way to input affinities here. So maybe A and B have the last name, have the same last name, or they have the same sort of @stanford.edu address or something. In that case, we prefer to keep them together. So we try and factor that in as well. And here's why you need the group. So this is an example of a previous system from the MIT Media Lab that was trying to do email visualization called theme mail. And what's happening here is that there are people on the far right column over there in white. And this is a list of all the people in the corpus. And what you're seeing here is all the significant words exchanged with that person over time. But the moment you have a long-term archive, you have thousands and thousands of people. 10,000 people is not uncommon. And therefore, clicking or even hovering on each one of them and trying to analyze relationships with each one of them is just hard. I would like to think of maybe my high school friends as a single group, all my friends on a particular project as a single group, and then sort of analyze them together instead of one at a time. So once we've organized by group, then we can do some visualizations. This is a stack graph visualization showing communication activity. So this is just number of messages with every group. And so we assign messages to the closest group, and then we say, okay, let's plot. This is my own archive, by the way. So it tells me stories about what's happening here. So for example, the one in orange over there, the third one is the company I was at before, and then I came to Stanford in 2007, and that's sort of dropped off, even though it goes on a little bit. And the light blue over there is actually Monica. So that's where Monica takes off, and Monica has been going strong for a while. And then there are other collaborators who show up and leave, and projects that start and stop. My regular friends and family are sort of a small volume, but they're regular. They're throughout the background, and you can then hypothesize why there are peaks and so on. And if you don't like the stack graph, you can also break it apart and view each group individually and explore each group individually. So that's our entry point to just organizing the archive. Now we want to look at the actual contents of the archive, and we want to try and, because there is thousands of messages, you cannot read every one of them. You cannot even apply text summarization for every single message, because that would still be too many summaries to look at. So what we do instead is try and identify on a time basis what are the important topics of conversation. And the way we do that is to use text mining to figure out what, for every time unit, like let's say every month, what were the topics that were talked about. And here's an example of, this is a particular archive that we have at Stanford Libraries from this famous poet Robert Creeley. And if you run a standard text mining algorithm, you will get something that looks like this for the month of May. And there's some information here, like some terms probably mean something. There's also a lot of noise, like words like best and lovely and say and touch and things like that. And this is the same problem the theme mail system has. There's a lot of noise, and it's distracting, it's puzzling. Then you have to click on that and figure out why the system thinks say is a common word or something. Maybe it doesn't even matter. And so we were trying to fix this in many ways. We tried bigrams, we tried multi-word phrases to get more context and so on. Eventually, we made a very simple observation. If you look in this list, probably the ones that are most interesting are the proper nouns. So there are things like places, Waldoboro, Maine, which is where this poet lived, people he's been talking with, Helen and Robert, I don't know who they are, but presumably if he was looking at the archive, he would know who they were. So we restrict the analysis to just the names in the archive. So that's a good approximation. So it loses some content, but it increases the signal considerably. And you can see that these are already probably more evocative. And there's good reason in the memory research. It's known that episodic memory sort of focuses on names of people, places, events, and so on. So we use NLP tools to extract named entities and just score those, and then we can further use the groups that I mentioned earlier to maybe just color code or code somehow those terms. So now these terms are further categorized by color, and each color represents a particular group. So if you wanted to explore interactions with a particular group, what happened across time in different months with a particular group, you could do that easily just using color. And so we put all that together, and then one of the summaries we generate which is pretty useful, is a listing of, I guess you can't see it too clearly on this one, but is a listing of per month what are the terms. They're all color coded, so now you can explore these. You can also, of course, click on those terms and see what are the messages that are associated with that term. I'd like to mention one little technical idea here that we came up with on scoring these terms. So how would you extract the most important terms from for a given time period? And the way this is usually done is using something called a TF-IDF metric, which essentially tries to identify discriminative terms for each document in the corpus in general, but in this case it could just be like all the messages in a particular month. Okay, and the idea that we came up here with was that so if you want T, if you think of T as a significant term for month M, then there are two things that sort of need to happen or need to be correlated, which is that T needs to be mentioned frequently, but T should not be mentioned in the other in too many of the other months. So that if it's a very common term that's just not very discriminative, then you don't want that term to be scoring highly. And so traditionally that's the way TF-IDF is computed. What we did was instead just moved the computation. We replayed the messages in time, and then we compute the summary at every time instant, or every month in this case, in the sense that because you want to compute the summary of this month without knowledge of the future. The fact that this happens all the time in personal archives, the term T gets introduced. Think of this as maybe the name of a baby, or the beginning of a relationship, or beginning of an employment, or something like that, and then becomes common in the archive. So if you did traditional TF-IDF scoring, TF-IDF would actually dampen that term, because it's actually very common across, if you look at all the documents. But if you look at it in a time-based fashion, it's actually not that common. And what you should probably do is highlight that term as it emerges, and then slowly, of course, that term is no longer as novel, and then it can go down in terms of score. So that's the rough intuition. And I think, there are a lot of text-based corpora where TF-IDF is used, and some of them have timestamps in them, and you should definitely consider this variant if applicable for other kinds of text corpora as well. So the next challenge is, how do you engage people with the archive? How do you make them actually want to browse? How do you make them get to the valuable messages without wasting a lot of time, sorting through not so relevant messages? And what we did was we built early versions of the system, and the one observation we made was people would kind of get engrossed or engaged with messages that express deep emotion for obvious reasons. So things like celebrations, or things like maybe angry messages, or other kinds of emotion. And we realized that we could just automate that process and surface messages reflecting emotional terms, or actually it's more general than that. It's things like milestones and life events and travel and vacation, things that may be useful from a personal point of view. And so we have a custom lexicon that we developed for this. And the lexicon just means it's a bag of words for a bunch of categories, and we have maybe 20 categories and 500 words as the default. And users can, of course, edit it. But this has been a very popular feature with people because it helps them find interesting messages for them relatively easily. So some quotes like, "I just keep coming back to the sentiments view, it's so much fun." And this user is impressed by the fact the first message in the negative emotion category was, how did you know it was about the dentist and stuff like that. It's actually very simple, looking for negative emotion words. And we can do a similar plot of these sentiments over time of different categories, and you can see some of the categories here: congratulations, superlative, confidential, religion, festivals, vacations, health, racy words, emergencies, and so on, which may be interesting to browse. And this, by the way, is not my own sentiment graph. It's Sarah Palin's from her email archive, which was published last year. So there's 15,000 messages or something, and it actually already tells you some stories. So for example, in 2008, at the beginning, she had her 5th child, I think. So there's a bunch of congratulatory messages pouring in around that time. Then there's a second little bump here when she got the nomination with John McCain. And I think the data set sort of trails off at that point. That's why that's a smaller bump over there. But then you can, of course, now explore this by clicking on it and then looking at the actual messages. And this project is somewhat similar to a project that you might already be familiar with, We Feel Fine, where they did a very simple analysis of blog posts around the world and just look for the phrase I feel or I am feeling. And then they categorized what people were feeling. And then they correlated that with demographics and made hypotheses like older people get happier or something like that. Apparently that's a true hypothesis, I believe. So it's the same thing. It's a very simple, lightweight tool that people actually enjoy using and exploring for their own data. Here's another form of here's another possible way to try and engage people with the archive, and this was actually suggested by Paul Sass, who was here for the HCI seminar in the fall, and I was showing him all the key summaries per month and so on, and he said, why don't you turn that back into a question and ask people, what do you think is in your archive? What is the summary of that month, as a sort of memory game for them? And this may be particularly useful for people who have memory problems and things like that. And so I took that idea and I turned that into something that looks like this. So just a standard crossword. And so we take all the important terms and lay out as many of them as we can on a crossword grid. And then the clues are really just very simple. We just take a sentence in the archive that contains the word and then blank it out. And let people play around with it. And I must say we haven't really tested this too much. It's just like a fun thing. But I mean, just I tried this myself, and it's just, it's kind of fun, and it's also a little bit surprising. It's pretty much like solving a regular crossword, except it's with your own data. There are some things that are easy, some things that are hard. Things become progressively easier, and then there's this aha moment when you get a particularly hard one. So this is something that we want to see if this engages people some more. Okay, so I've talked about how you can sort of identify interesting messages and get to the details. It's really important to have a good interface to browse the actual messages, because that's where the memorable details are. Everything else is just a cue to your memory to remember something that happened, and then you want to actually browse the content of the message. And we have a bunch of features to help that happen. So the first is just a fairly straightforward faceted browsing interface, so people can turn on and off facets, like filters, say that I want to see positive messages with that group, perhaps from that folder, or something like that. So apart from facets, we also insert hyperlinks. So remember, we know the important words because we have the summaries. And what we try and do is automatically insert hyperlinks where possible to other messages that have that term. And I think this is, this automatic hyperlinking is really useful, because as you're reading this message, you can of course ignore the hyperlink, but you can also click on it if it's interesting. And I think, in the original vision of the Memex, I think this is partly what Bush meant about this point about associative memory was not about people writing ahref links, but about the system automatically being able to connect related things together. And finally, we have, there are lots of messages typically. Again, this is a long-term archive in this particular view. This I think is, this is from the Robert Creeley corpus again. There's 1,400 messages with a term over there. Right? That's a lot of messages to browse through. And so what we did was an interface that allows clickless skimming. So it allows you to move rapidly between the different messages without clicks. So you can imagine that clicking 1,400 times or even keep pressing a lot of times is pretty fatiguing. And so that's why we built this interface where people can just jog around, which I mean, a lot of people seem to like that a lot. And it helps them quickly skim because you don't want to actually read everything. You just want things to flash by and stop when something interesting happens. It's somewhat like the experience of.
That wheel is basically acting as a scroll bar.
Yes, but with the important difference that it's a page-based view. So every message, there's 1,000 messages, but they're all one behind the other, like in a book. So the position of the headers remains fixed. It's not actually moving around, and you can keep your gaze fixed and keep moving and stop when you see something interesting. Like a microfilm machine, but there I think it actually moves across, and here we are just sort of refreshing quickly. Here's another interface for exploration which is pretty useful, which is just to view all the attachments together. And we've put them on the Cool Iris photo wall, which is like a nicely designed panable and zoomable interface for pictures. So again, this is from the Robert Creeley archive. There are about 6,000 attachments, 4,000 pictures. It's really hard to click on messages, open the attachment, and so on. So this is a nice way to just scan all the pictures that he had in his archive, and the other, the non-pictures, you can just sort of open them up in whatever application. But
these are pictures, not attachments.
These are picture attachments.
On the sent mail?
This is actually everything. In this particular case, it's all of Creeley's archive.
I guess I'm particularly, most of the pictures in my email are like random gifts from mailing lists, and they don't look nearly this beautiful.
So that does happen. Logos and things like that show up occasionally. We uniquify them. That means that we'll show one picture only once. So there's some noise. Hopefully you can ignore it. But also,
like which of these are actually from his email and which are from another source?
They're all from his email. And this is also, remember, this is probably a 90s archive. I mean, it begins in 95 and goes till 2005 or something, where there was not so much photo sharing going on, much more sharing over email. And even today, there is sharing over email, except that it's sporadic. It's kind of one-off picture from the party that someone emailed you. And we found that users really like browsing these attachments because it's very hard normally to revisit emails. I mean, you never do that, right? Revisit emails, open up attachments, and once it scrolls off the top of the screen, it's kind of gone from memory. And therefore, it really revived people's memories of long forgotten pictures. I mean, so there's a mom who said, "Oh, I thought I'd lost these pictures of my son's first year, and here they are lying in some message I sent to somebody." So with that, so I'll turn now. So that is the technical part. But the interesting question is, what do users actually use it for once they have a system like this? And we have had the system used by I personally conducted interviews with maybe about 30-ish people, and then we've released the system to the public, and people can download it and run it, and we've got a bunch of feedback from that. So I've just sort of categorized some of the more interesting comments into three. So this one. This slide captures some of the comments related to reminiscence or recollection. So adding color to flashbulb memories. Flashbulb memories are the memories you have of significant, well-remembered events, consequential events for you, like say 9/11 or your thesis defense, I guess. And what the archives add to that is sort of an in-the-moment record of what was happening. And you have this comment that I'd forgotten about the lunch we organized before. the thesis defense. And so it adds sort of evidence to the event or color to the event. Extract milestones. So this offers a complete history of my first son's milestones. So that sentiment is also pretty common because, I mean, what's going on there, I think, is that, again, this is a mom speaking, I think, to, perhaps based on email messages, she was sending out updates about, kids growing up or something. And it's very interesting that it often happens that when you cross information from one group to another, that's like a neat summary of sort of what's been happening. So for example, my work group knows about sort of the summary of what's happening in the family and vice versa. There's also this idea of nostalgia and resharing information. I'd like to remind my dad of the advice when he gave me, that he gave me when I came to the US for the first time. And so this suggests, I mean, there's of course nostalgia, but there's also this idea of sort of reinforcing connections based on shared past experiences that I think people might enjoy. So it might be interesting to think about aesthetic interfaces that allow people to reshare old messages for the sake of this fun and nostalgia, the way you look at old pictures. There are a bunch of just utilitarian purposes for which MUSE is useful. For example, there's a startup founder saying that my email has all the company stuff, and I don't really have processes in the company to save all this thing, but it's nice for me to be able to just take all the attachments in one shot and stash them away and create a backup. Mundane things like summarize work progress, like I have to write a performance summary for the year and remember all the little things that I did in the year, and this just helps jog my memory about all the things that I did. And this is another big one, which is identify personal email, because people are losing their email when they leave jobs, because they're not allowed to take emails out. I mean, some people will take it out anyway, but for the most part, people just lose access to that, which is a pity. So if you had the personal groups, and there's a way by which you can export messages related to specific groups, you can just take your email with you when you leave. And then finally, ways to renew and reflect on relationships. This is also a common theme. People expressing almost surprise that they were so close to people at some point, but then someone moved and then they lost the relationship, and wishing that they'd kept in touch and things like that. There's this one on feeling a renewed sense of confidence, just looking back at achievements or awards and things like that. So this is a well-known use of archives, which is to reinforce confidence, and that's why people put up whatever they put up on the walls, university degrees and awards and things like that. So it probably doesn't make sense to have like a digital photo frame showing congratulatory emails up on the wall, but maybe some other sort of ambient or some interface that can boost your confidence, remind you of good times, good achievements when needed. And also, just this common theme of remembering tasks and intentions. I was planning to write this paper. I don't quite know, but I just forgot about it. People frequently had that comment. And then there was this one very interesting message I received, which I'm going to let you read for a minute. So there's a person who's having memory problems and needs artifacts to help revive their memory. And I'm obviously not a memory researcher myself, but I'd love to explore this with someone who actually is a memory expert, and maybe maybe there's a way to help people entering Alzheimer's or something by giving them memory games and exercises and so on. And I'll just quickly mention, so when we started the work, we were just talking about personal archives. You're looking back at your own records. We came across a couple of other interesting use cases, which unfortunately I don't have time to go in detail into, but it's been a very important part of the project. In particular, archivists receiving lots of email collections from eminent people. I mean, they're supposed to keep this for the historical record, but now they're getting lots of digital stuff that's just essentially dumped on them with very little organization. And they need tools to sort of go through, sort through, organize, clean, and deliver the material. There's obviously lots of confidential material in there, and they have to redact something. So they're actually limited by tools to process the information. And similarly, journalists are getting all kinds of email dumps. I was talking to the Knight Fellows on Wednesday, and they're getting all kinds of dumps from FOIA requests or whistleblowers or whoever. And they're purely limited by bandwidth in terms of being able to scan tens of thousands of messages. So if we can give them tools where they can ferret out interesting information, that might be useful. So that ends the browsing part of the talk, and I'll mention a few related projects. There's a couple of projects from Microsoft, My Life Bits and Life Browser, where the focus is more on, instead of focusing on one data type like email, they try and handle email and chat and photos and put them all on a single timeline or something. Pensieve is an interesting project from Cornell, but what they do is they will send you, they want to encourage you to reminisce and capture information, and they will send you emails every day asking you questions, and you're supposed to input information and build up a sort of corpus for reminiscence over time. And finally, Jigsaw is a system from Georgia Tech that has some interesting text mining and visualization techniques, but it's more targeted towards the intelligence community looking for suspicious patterns and so on, not so much at personal reflection and analysis. So moving on to the idea of experience-infused applications. So these are applications that can benefit by having access to your archive, but you don't have to think about applying your archive to them. They're already running, they're connected to the archive, and the question is, how then can we make use of archive sort of in the flow? And the obvious answer, even though it took us a while to realize, is a big application is personalization. Because your personal archive captures everything about you. You've been talking on a daily basis about all kinds of things. It knows which people you're talking to. It knows what you're saying perhaps on different social networks if you can aggregate all the information. But personalization today is essentially marketing driven. You give all your data up to some service provider, and then maybe they'll give you a better service in return, which is really, privacy is a little bit creepy in some ways. It's very fragmented, so everyone is trying to generate profiles of us. Google has one, Facebook has one, Microsoft has one, Amazon, Netflix, and so on and on. And it's very opaque. You have no idea what they're really doing with the data. So the question is, can we somehow have some aspects of personalization that can be user-driven, user remains in control, privacy respecting. So you only give out data when you need to and as little as you need to. Can it be unified? So there's a particular advantage of doing it at the user end, because only the user sees data across different networks. Google cannot see Facebook's data and vice versa. And it should be transparent so that people know exactly how systems are personalizing some content for them. So we came up with this idea of an experience-infused browser, which, so if you think about it, the way you look at, say, scanning web pages, and I'm talking of things like news pages or listings and things like that, which are typically fairly long. No one actually takes the trouble of reading them sequentially. You just kind of skim through them and look for things that might interest you, and you do that essentially through the lens of your personal, history. You do that through based on your personal interests, your preferences, and so on. And so the question is, maybe we can handwave a little bit and call that lens, we can make the digital archive act as a sort of lens on top of all this, of all the sites, and interpose that between the browser and the page, or sit on the side of the browser and kind of illuminate the page in some way, in a way that's personalized. And if you think about this is what you're essentially doing manually anyway. Your brain is picking out terms on the page that jump out at you, and we're just helping that effect along. So this is how it works. So it's a browser extension to Firefox or Chrome. So the user loads a page in the browser, and the user can start interacting with the page as usual. But on the side, we have we have the extension that is extracting all the names from the page and giving them to a scoring function based on your archive. So like I said, the archive is actually fairly small. It's only a few hundred megabytes or something, so you can look it up fairly quickly. And you can score all the terms in the archive and you can find out what's the most relevant, and then based on the scoring function and some highlighting policy, what we do in this browser is very simple. Just introduce highlights on the page for terms that have significant representation in your archive. And there's all kinds of ways you can do the scoring, but that's the rough idea. So the effect is something like, imagine you had a secretary who read all your email and prepared every page for you by marking it up with a highlighter. That's the approximate thing. And of course, we don't get everything right, just like a secretary needs to be trained up in what is relevant, what is important, and what is not. And by the way, the real news is, so this can happen at fairly interactive rates. I mean, it takes about 2 to 3 seconds for, say, this is the New York Times page, and it would take me more than 2 or 3 seconds to just scan the entire page. Here's another topical example. This is the CHI 2012 proceedings page from the ACM Digital Library, and most people know how big that is. It's hard to digest in one go. So what I could do is just sort of mechanically turn this thing on, and on the CHI proceedings page, it actually does take significantly longer, like 15 seconds or something. But that's still much less than I would spend browsing, and it just highlights all the people I know, and it's the usual suspects over here, I guess. I can, of course, if I don't remember a particular name, I can click on the name and click through to the actual messages that contain that name. Or if I don't like some names, we sometimes get things wrong because the named entities recognizer gets things wrong or something. Users can just sort of train it with one click, dismiss the term, and then that term goes away, it isn't shown again. So this gives you the effect of mechanical recall for all the things, all the people that you've seen, and brings that onto the page. So we did a little study of this with 9 users browsing organically for 1 hour, and there's some interesting stories in the paper. But the broad takeaway is that there are 2 major uses. One is personalizing busy web pages. So things like the news site where there's lots of different things, and you just are interested in a very small subset of them. The other is highlighting serendipitous and forgotten connections from the archives. It's often people names or something that you've forgotten. You've seen it before, but you can't quite remember where you've seen it. And then this highlights, and then you click through and you say, oh, this is the person who emailed me 3 years ago or something. So what kind of things is it useful for based on our studies? So things like news sites, listings, long documents on the web. Commerce sites tend to be busy. They have lots of stuff on them. Things like comments widgets. Again, you're not going to read all of them. These are all things that you kind of mostly skim and look for things interesting to you. What do people discover? The number one thing people like to discover is people that they know or like or have discussed. It doesn't have to be a person I've actually corresponded with, but if I'm a fan of a football player or something, and his name shows up, then that name is promoted to me in a sense by the highlights. Organizations that they're affiliated with. I mean, it's very interesting for me to find, say, an article that mentions Stanford on the New York Times homepage. Things like product names that they own, places that they've been to, countries they're from, and so on. And since the tool is agnostic, it just highlights text anywhere on the page, and sometimes it even finds ads that may or may not be interesting to the user, but at least personalized. And I'd like to mention a related piece of work called Margin Notes from MIT, but I think it's almost 10 years ago, where what they did was, as you're reading a document, they're trying to suggest other documents for you to read. So you're reading a paper and there's other related papers, which is sort of a similar idea, but in the context of linear reading of a document, and they're using TF-IDF and so on to score other papers that are related to this paper and things like that. And instead, what we're trying to do is use the archive, not actually promote reading of the archive, but use that to illuminate the page when possible. And I'll mention a final idea. I think I have about 5 minutes. So can we use the archive for web search? And we have a very simple idea there too. And the idea is basically trying to tackle this problem. So this was an example from last year, some of you may have seen, where there was this big story about how JCPenney was gaming Google's results. And of course, everyone does that. Everyone tries to do that these days. And how there's some speculation that maybe Google let it go on for longer than they should have because they are JCPenney is a big advertiser on Google. And this one actually, my wife went and bought bedding after doing an online search from JCPenney. So this sort of personally rankles. This was a few months before the story came out. And so the idea that we came up with is that your archives have all kinds of links embedded in them, links that you're sending to friends, your friends are sending to you. And for this work, we broadened the definition of archive to include tweets of people that you're following. And we do a very simple thing. So we say, let's create a search index per user, which is populated using social chatter. Social chatter in this experiment is essentially email and Twitter. And can we come up, what happens when we just feed those domains and just restrict search to those domains? So an example is you email a link or someone tweets a link like that one, and then you treat that as a sort of endorsement for Stack Overflow. So if you're a programmer, your social chat is probably full of Stack Overflow. If you're a designer, it's full of Smashing Mag. If you're a high school math student, it's full of whatever websites high school math students read. And what we do is when user launches a search, we restrict search results to those domains. So this is very similar to the site colon modifier you might be familiar with on Google Advanced Search, but except that we're using a feature on Google called Custom Search Engine, which allows you to programmatically upload thousands of domains. And so that's what we do. We take all the domains that are in the social chatter, we weigh them based on frequency, and then we send that to Google, and then Google Custom Search Engine will return results that are biased towards those domains. And we call the project Slant because it's slanting the search results towards those. And this is a test user interface that for a study where we asked people to look back at searches that they had recently conducted on Google and redo the search on this. We didn't tell them which search engine was which, and then we asked them to rate how the results were for every search engine. And turns out this is email, that's Twitter, so of course the search engine is already trying to do personalization for you. So it's signed in personalized Google search that we're comparing with. And a couple of others where we sort of do query expansion by throwing in your friend's name and seeing if your friends have something to say about that topic. Then another one which was just human curated but not personalized. And I'll just summarize the results very quickly here. So the surprising finding was that at least in this study, it's a small study, it probably needs to be expanded, was that the email-based search engine actually was rated the highest, followed by Twitter, followed by personalized Google. And also the interesting thing was that for different categories of queries, there's this well-known query taxonomy by Andre Broder on informational, transactional, and navigational. Each search engine was best for a different category. So email is good for transactions because it has sites that you transact with on a regular basis. Navigation is, Google is best at that because it's sort of just people typing in Twitter to go to twitter.com. And information the information queries were best answered by the Twitter search engine because we're probably getting a lot of relevant information on Twitter.
What's the y-axis?
It's a rating from 1 to 5.
Those are stars that were across the previous slide.
Yes. Yes, I think it's the average rating. Yes, it's the average rating. This one starts at 0, so I'm trying to think if we allow people to give a 0 star or not. I think we did, perhaps. Yeah, that goes above 4. So I'm pretty sure that's what we did. So briefly, the findings were that this is successful in eliminating web spam. It's good at disambiguating queries because these search engines already have your context. You don't need to type long queries, and it's well known that query length has been going up on Google. It's almost approaching 4 words per query now because there's so much noise in the web, so you have to be really specific to get the results you want. So this is good at disambiguating queries because, for example, for me, my top site, top weighted site is ACM, second is Stanford, and then I have maybe my hometown newspaper and things like that. So these are all sites that I trust and that are probably talking about the same kind of things that I'm interested in. And that's why it's good at, and we have some good examples in the paper about why that works. Better privacy, so of course in this example I'm revealing my preferred domains to a search engine like Google, but at least it's only looking at the domains. They don't have to look at all my email to provide me the personalized service. And the surprising thing also is that there are only a few thousand domains per user. It's typically on the order of 2,000-3,000 domains, and you still get pretty good results. So this sort of, is going back to the old Yahoo model of the directory, where people are human curating links and saying, oh, that's good, that's good, that's good. And now we're imposing search on top of a human curated list of sites. So this potentially has big implications for search engine in the future. I mean, everyone can have one. Think of it that way, but customized, tuned to their chatter. Better privacy, of course. You can probably consume more information implicitly instead of trying to read things directly, like mailing lists and so on. You could imagine, like I now subscribe to mailing lists that I have no intention of ever reading, but I know that they're high quality and they're sending links my way, and I'll just pipe it into my index and use it while searching. And I don't have to remember recommendations that are coming to me on Twitter or whatever, and remember to use them when I need to use them. Instead, I'll just try and, in the moment, while doing search, try and incorporate those recommendations in some way. So I'll conclude with a list of contributions. So we built a system to explore personal archives, and I think it's really important to build it, release it. That's when you discover the interesting use cases and novel applications. We have about 5,000 downloads so far. We've come up with specific techniques for mining and interaction. We've thought of some new ways of web personalization that preserve user privacy, and by doing it at user end. And hopefully we have some learnings that may influence future designs and inspire more and better designs. So looking ahead, we can imagine, so we have done a sort of deep dive on email and what you can do with email, but you can imagine trying to broaden the index now to other things like social feeds and web pages. We've started doing a little bit with Facebook profiles and LinkedIn profiles now. But also, think of things like, going back to the Bush vision of all the books you've read and all the things you've learned and so on. There's no reason why a student shouldn't put all the material that he has learned with into the archive, and then be able to recall that, use that when needed at some point in the future. Maybe all the books you've read, all the books that you wish you had read, latent social connection. So there's a social connection of some sort between me and everyone in the room, or between all of us, though it may not be materialized on any particular social network. But you could imagine sucking the information and putting it into your index, so that if and when we meet again, then that information should be able to be surfaced in context. So I think I'm going to stop and leave time for questions. I'd just like to mention that, the takeaways I get from this piece of work is that personal archives capture important history. Users can and should make special efforts to capture, preserve, and put it to use. And I'd like to, think about other kinds of applications that can benefit by experience infusion, as we call it. So if you have a history of something, apply it to whatever you're doing in the moment. Someone was suggesting that you put all your code in there, you index all the code, and then whenever you're browsing documentation, things that are related to the kind of code that you write sort of pop up. There may be other applications like that. So I'd like to thank Monica in particular for spearheading the project and being full of completely crazy ideas. But it's been so much fun. We started building I think we started building a distributed file system with usability built in. And I'm not quite sure how we ended up with this, but we went through a whole bunch of ideas in between. The entire HCI gang, Jeff, we've learned a lot from systems you've built, and the idea of going beyond papers and releasing software and learning from that and informing research. Scott for teaching everything from 147 to 376 and spearheading the HCI gang here. Terry and Stu for being so incredibly accessible and friendly. Priya, thanks for coming and also showing me how history researchers actually work and the user interface problems that they have to deal with. Abhinay did a lot of the work on the experience-infused applications. Diana and TJ worked on the grouping algorithms. Peter Chan from the Green Library was invaluable in finding the applications with the archivists and for archives. Cindy did some of the design. Lots of other collaborators in Stanford libraries. Glenn is here. Daniel Hartwig, Stanford archivist, teamed up with several of the Knight Fellows over the years. All the students in purple, Moby Social HCI, lab sponsors, family and friends. So with that, I think we have like 7-8 minutes for questions. Oh, and by the way, try it out. So you can go to mobisocial/muse and let me know what you think.
I was thinking that on the lines of highlighting terms on web pages, it may make a lot of sense for me to have these things highlighted on listings where I'm looking for something very specific, or maybe on Amazon so that I don't go off on a trajectory and buy something I don't need. But when I'm looking at the MUSE side, essentially the idea is to sort of back off and look at what's going on in the world. And at that point, focusing on something I am more interested in already might not be the best idea. So have you explored that dimension where you go on and actually sort of force the user to highlight things that diversify the user's vision instead of making it more bold?
Yeah, that's a great question. You don't want people to be just reinforcing what they already know and living in a filter bubble, sort of. So that's a question that's somewhat independent of what kind of personalization that's being used. I mean, that's true for whatever the Times is doing in terms of personalization for me today. How do they make sure that you have diversity? And one of the things you can do is just make sure that above the fold, editors have control, and below the fold, we've actually tried this where we reorder articles based on just for below the fold articles, which probably you wouldn't get to because there's too many of them. They're all kind of smallish articles. But there you want personalization, but maybe not for the big picture. So you leave that untouched. And that's an example. Same thing for the search results. You may want diversity in the search results, not the same thing again and again. And we haven't really explored how we integrate results from different search engines and what it means to achieve that diversity. There is some work in the search engine world for that specific problem. But yeah, I mean, I agree that that's a concern.
So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about recently in relationship to how education and like how we can digitalize our information for education is that we don't always want to access it at the same granularity. So for like when you're saying, let's put all our textbooks into our personal archive, I don't necessarily want to get like the nitty-gritty details every time I think about some concept in the textbook. Sometimes I want like the high-level oversights. Do you know of any, or have you thought about much about that, like kind of mid-range and granularity?
I mean, not really. That was just an idea. But I think, as we build up these archives, we'll need to build in semantics. Right now, it's a dumb, just throw the text in there and, we'll index it and search for it. But in reality, now you may want to have shades of trust in the material. Or here are different kinds of material. Here is, here's a ACM computing surveys versus here's all the papers in Chi, right? They're not quite the same thing. So I think you will need to build up going forward these sort of labels on the data and still have user-friendly ways of filtering them and so on.
Okay. One more, Jeff.
Okay, Jeff.
So I just wanted to say two compliments. So first, I think the idea of experience-fused apps is incredibly exciting. You've seen things like readware and editware where you take people's use within an application and use that to bootstrap new interactions. The idea of taking life experience and putting that into other applications, I think has a huge design space and research questions to explore. So opening that up is really exciting. The second, I think your work provides a nice reminder of the power of putting research software out in the world, both in terms of making an impact, but also feeding back into the research process. And so I really like the quotes you had to do that. So as for all the other students in the room, that's a good thing to remember. It's worth the effort to do that. And then finally, just a question. For the applications that you showed, you deployed them as part of your evaluation, but they weren't really evaluated in a comparative manner. And so I'm curious about how you negotiated the design space, How did you know which decisions were the right ones and how they impact user experience? And I think this is a really interesting question more generally, because you're in a domain where it's not about time and error. It's about things like reminiscence and sense of connection. And so can you say something about your approach to evaluation in this space and what lessons others might learn?
So I agree, and that's a problem that we struggled with initially, because there were no comparative designs, and we were also more interested, rather than some nitty-gritty of the text mining algorithm or something, we were more interested in getting to the actual uses of those things. So one of the things we just did was a ton of iterative design based on user feedback. So we probably had 5 rounds of feedback before we even sent in our our papers and so on. And we learned a lot. I mean, there's just no substitute for sitting with a user and then just have them engage with, in this case, archives, and giving you, thinking out loud and giving you comments. So I think we've definitely navigated that part of the space where we're doing more qualitative work with an idea to uncovering uses, which can then go back deeper into specific design ideas, which can then be evaluated. So for example, is the jog dial the right idea? I'm not really sure. I know people like it. But now you can start imagining that, oh yeah, people need a way to scroll quickly through 1,000 pages. And now you can say, oh, here's a jog dial, here's like a slider or something else that perhaps may be a better design choice. And then you can go evaluate that, now that you know that there is a real need behind it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.